This is the story of how Caesar and Pompey went from friends to enemies to turning their friendship into an everlasting curse on Rome. In the last episode we saw Julius Caesar return to Rome as dictator after defeating the Gauls, only to find his power opposed by a group of senators led by none other than his former ally Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, better known simply as Pompey. As we'll see, their falling out was so bitter that it ended up shattering their friendship and tainting all of Rome with their hatred towards each other. So let's just get right into it. So let's start with how they became friends in the first place. Originally hailing from a minor noble family, Caesar had built up a reputation for extravagance and debauchery, but this was not well seen upon by the Roman elite. And during Caesar's absence fighting the Gallic Wars, a group of senators conspired to overthrow him and place his adopted son Octavian on the throne instead. However, thanks to Cicero's opposition, this plot failed. And when Caesar returned to Rome, he was welcomed with a triumph. Though it seemed like everything was all right, Caesar knew that he could never trust the Roman Senate again. To make matters worse, his relationship with his father-in-law Crassus, who was one of the richest men in Rome, also soured. Therefore, desperate for new allies, Caesar turned to the most powerful man in Rome, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, or Pompey the Great. Pompey hailed from a prominent family of Roman nobles, and since he was young, he displayed both courage and political ambition, which would serve him well later in life. In fact, while still just a young man, Pompey was appointed military tribune at the Social War, where he successfully defended the Roman town of Asculum. But soon after, Pompey's father died, forcing him to abandon the war and return to Rome. There Pompey was elected military tribune and spent several years campaigning against the pirates. After this, Pompey defeated the rebel king Mithridates in the First Mithridatic War and acquired vast wealth for himself and the Roman Senate. Back in Rome, Pompey was given a hero's welcome and was celebrated for his accomplishments. And so when Caesar approached Pompey about forming an alliance, Pompey's father-in-law, the aforementioned Marcus Crassus, suggested they form a three-way partnership with himself. Thus, the first triumvirate was formed, uniting the most powerful men in Rome and giving them complete control over the city. Soon after, Caesar was appointed governor of Cisalpine Gaul, while Pompey received Illyria and further provinces. So for 10 years, they kept a close eye on each other's activities. Caesar began conquering one tribe after another, defeating Vercingetorix at the siege of Alesia, and gaining immense fame throughout the whole of Gaul. Meanwhile, Pompey expanded his influence in the east, crushing the rebellion of the Roman client King Archelaus, and then marrying the daughter of King Mithridates VI of Pontus. Now back in Rome, the triumvirate was beginning to fall apart. Crassus had already died in battle against the Parthians, and without him, the alliance was bound to fail. Sure enough, the rivalry between Caesar and Pompey grew and eventually erupted into civil war. The reason for the conflict was mainly due to their opposing views. You see, Caesar viewed the Roman Republic as something that should be ruled by the people. Meanwhile, Pompey represented the interests of the aristocracy, and as the two sides clashed, the Roman system began to break down and crumble. In fact, the growing divide had already led to open violence on several occasions. For example, in 67 BC, when Lucius Sergius Catiline attempted to seize power, Caesar sided with the Optimates or the establishment, while Pompey supported the Populares or the reformers. And though Catiline ultimately failed, Caesar took full advantage of the chaos and gained considerable influence. He was even appointed Pontifex Maximus, the highest religious office in Rome, solidifying his status. But around this time, Pompey began flirting with the idea of ruling Rome himself. You see, there was a clear power dynamic between him and Caesar. While Caesar was busy conquering new lands, Pompey was in charge of keeping order in Rome itself. And therefore, when the time came for Caesar to return home, Pompey was the one in charge of defending Rome. The stage was set for a confrontation between the two former friends. As Caesar crossed the Rubicon River with his army, he famously declared, "The die is cast," and marched on to sack and pillage the city of Rome. But although Rome was largely on Pompey's side, the civil war didn't last long. In fact, just a year later, Pompey was forced to flee to Greece after losing almost his entire fleet to Caesar's navy in the Battle of Pharsalus. And thus, Rome had fallen to Caesar. After defeating Pompey, Caesar completed his conquest of the rest of Italy and returned to Rome as sole ruler. He wasted no time in consolidating his power and embarked on a series of reforms. He reorganized the courts, reformed the calendar, debased the currency, and established colonies in new territories. On top of that, he also launched an extensive building campaign, constructing temples, public works, and monuments across the city. It seemed that Caesar had secured his legacy and made Rome into a shining beacon of civilization. But his rivals weren't willing to accept defeat. You see, Caesar's victory at Pharsalus had driven many of his enemies into exile, the most notable being Pompey. Pompey had fled to Egypt and formed an alliance with its new ruler, Ptolemy XIII. However, shortly after his arrival, Pompey was murdered at the request of King Ptolemy. Some accounts say that Ptolemy's mother, Cleopatra, was behind the assassination, as she wanted her son to consolidate power. But whatever the true reason may have been, The murder of Pompey sent shockwaves throughout Rome and ignited a desire for revenge within Caesar. Determined to avenge his friend's death, Caesar set sail for Egypt and demanded that Cleopatra hand over the murderers. Though she initially resisted, Cleopatra eventually gave in and surrendered the assassins. But as Caesar entered the city, he learned that it had been fortified by Ptolemy's forces and was under attack by his navy. Despite this, Caesar remained undeterred and pressed on to take the city. During the siege, Caesar's ships were destroyed and he was forced to flee for safety. However, thanks to Cleopatra's help, Caesar managed to regroup and eventually laid siege to the city once more. As the Egyptian army prepared for the onslaught, one of Cleopatra's advisors suggested that she seduce Caesar and use her feminine wiles to persuade him to end the siege and take her as his lover. Although it may seem like a cheap trick straight out of an old Hollywood film, it was actually quite common practice among powerful women of that era, and sure enough, Cleopatra lured Caesar into her chambers, captured his heart, and persuaded him to lift the siege of Alexandria. Soon after, the two were sailing back to Rome together, where Caesar made Cleopatra his queen. However, the people of Rome hated Cleopatra, and her presence only fueled the fire of rebellion against Caesar. And before long, a senator named Julius Caesar approached Caesar and asked him to restore his brother Publius's citizenship, who had been stripped away by Caesar during the Civil War. But when Caesar rejected his request, Cimber grabbed hold of Caesar's toga and pulled him toward the senators. With the help of a few accomplices, they plunged their daggers into Caesar, inflicting 6 wounds before finally killing him. With Caesar dead, the Roman Republic seemed destined to rise from the ashes and continue as before. And though his adopted son Octavian would go on to become the first emperor of Rome, the damage done by Caesar and Pompey had already been done. Their quest for absolute power had shattered the old Roman system forever. Now you might be wondering what happened to Pompey's statue after his demise. Well, according to Plutarch, it was erected in the temple of Bellona, the goddess of war. Furthermore, he says that after Caesar's death, Mark Antony ordered it to be taken down because he blamed Pompey for deceiving Caesar and inciting his murder. However, Plutarch leaves us with a little mystery here because he doesn't explicitly state what happened to the statue after it was removed from the temple. This lack of clarity has left us with several questions. What exactly did the statue look like? Where was it moved to? And ultimately, what happened to it? Unfortunately, the answers to these questions have been lost to history. We don't know if the statue was sculpted from marble, bronze, or stone, nor do we have any record of who sculpted it or what style it followed. In fact, all we know about its appearance is that it was tall and imposing, befitting of a man of Pompey's stature. Similarly, we have no record of where the statue ended up after being removed from the Temple of Bellona. It's possible that it was melted down and repurposed for another use, but this is pure speculation. All we know for sure is that it disappeared sometime after Mark Antony's death in 32 BC, and that is why, until this day, we can only wonder what happened to Pompey's statue and what it looked like. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.